The prayer bells of Tashilhunpo Monastery had rung at dawn for over 5 centuries, their bronze voices carrying across the windswept valleys of Shigatse like ancient secrets whispered to the mountains. But on the morning of September 15, 1995, something felt different in the thin air of the Tibetan plateau. The bells rang as they always had, but one voice was missing from the chorus of morning prayers that followed. Tenzin Norbu should have been kneeling in the 3rd row of the main prayer hall, his burgundy robes arranged precisely, as he had learned during his 7 years at the monastery. At 19, he was neither the youngest nor the oldest among the monks, but there was something about him that drew attention even in silence. Perhaps it was the way he held his prayer beads, each movement deliberate yet fluid, as if he understood something about devotion that others were still learning. Or maybe it was his eyes, dark and deep, holding a stillness that seemed to reflect the vast sky above the Himalayas. The other monks noticed his absence immediately. In a community where every breath was synchronized with ancient rhythms, where every footstep followed paths worn smooth by generations of faithful feet, the empty space where Tenzin should have been felt as pronounced as a missing note in a familiar melody. Lobsang Tenzin, the elderly monk who had served as Tenzin Norbu's mentor, felt his stomach tighten with an inexplicable dread as he scanned the rows of bowed heads. After the morning prayers concluded, Lobsang made his way to Tenzin's modest cell, his worn leather sandals whispering against the stone floors that had been polished by countless pilgrims over the centuries. The cell was exactly as it should be, prayer books stacked neatly, a small butter lamp flickering beside a framed photograph of the Dalai Lama, a simple wooden bowl for tsampa still holding traces of the previous evening's meal. Everything was in its proper place, yet everything felt wrong. The search began quietly, as all things did within the monastery walls. Monks moved through corridors and courtyards with purpose, but without panic, checking the library where Tenzin often spent hours copying ancient texts in his careful script, examining the meditation caves carved into the mountainside where he sometimes sought solitude. They searched the butter lamp room, the kitchen where he had recently been assigned to help with the morning preparations, and even the rarely visited upper chambers where old thangkas were stored away from the harsh mountain light. As the sun climbed higher over the jagged peaks, casting sharp shadows across the monastery's whitewashed walls, the search expanded beyond the sacred boundaries. The local villagers, weathered faces creased with concern, joined the effort. They knew Tenzin Norbu not just as a young monk, but as the boy who had arrived at the monastery as a child of 12, his parents having made the difficult decision to offer their son to the Buddhist path during a time when such choices carried both spiritual significance and political risk. His mother, Dolma, had wept silently as she handed him over, her tears freezing almost instantly in the mountain air. His father, a barley farmer named Pemba, had placed his rough hands on the boy's shoulders and whispered something that only Tenzin had heard. The memory of that moment, the smell of his father's woolen chuba, the sound of prayer flags snapping in the wind, the way the monastery bells had seemed to welcome him, had sustained Tenzin through his early years of homesickness and spiritual struggle. The village search parties spread out across the familiar terrain like tributaries of a river, following paths that led to barley fields, grazing areas where yaks moved like dark clouds against the golden grass, and the sacred lake where locals came to make offerings and seek blessings. The landscape was both beautiful and unforgiving, vast expanses of high-altitude desert punctuated by snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the endless blue sky. It was easy to imagine how someone could simply disappear into such immensity, becoming one more grain of sand in an ocean of stone and sky. By evening, when the prayer bells rang again and the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Tenzin Norbu had not been found. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication that he had packed belongings or made preparations to leave. He had simply vanished, as completely as a prayer flag eventually fades under the relentless mountain sun. If this story moves you to believe in mysteries that transcend our understanding, you might want to subscribe to hear more stories that explore the profound connections between faith, disappearance, and discovery. The local authorities were notified, but in 1995, in a region where the political situation remained tense and resources were limited, the investigation was more symbolic than substantive. Forms were filled out, statements were taken, and search parties organized by officials who seemed to understand that in a land as vast as Tibet, finding one missing person was like searching for a specific snowflake in an avalanche. Lobsang Tenzin spent that first night without sleep, walking the monastery grounds as if his feet could somehow track the path his young student had taken. The old monk had seen many changes in his 73 years, the arrival of new political realities, the departure of familiar faces, the constant dance between preservation and adaptation that defined modern monastic life. But he had never experienced a disappearance quite like this. Tenzin Norbu had not been unhappy or restless. If anything, he had seemed more settled lately, more focused in his studies, more present during meditation sessions. The mystery deepened as the days passed. Other monks began to remember small details that might have been insignificant at the time, but now seemed to glow with potential meaning. Tenzin had been asking questions about remote monasteries, about the caves where ancient masters had once meditated in isolation for years at a time. He had been particularly interested in stories of the great yogis who had withdrawn from the world completely, seeking enlightenment in places so hidden that they became legends. 3 weeks after the disappearance, as the first snows began to dust the higher peaks, the search was officially suspended. Tenzin Norbu was declared missing, his name added to the monastery's prayer lists, and his empty cell was cleaned and prepared for the next young monk who would need a place to begin his spiritual journey. But Lobsang Tenzin refused to let go completely. Every morning for months he would pause at the spot where his student should have been kneeling, offering a silent prayer for wherever Tenzin might be. The seasons changed as they always do in the mountains, with dramatic suddenness and stunning beauty. Spring brought wildflowers to the lower valleys and the return of migratory birds whose songs seemed to carry messages across impossible distances. Summer brought pilgrims and tourists, their cameras clicking at the monastery's ancient architecture, their voices adding new languages to the multilingual prayers that rose each day toward the infinite sky. Autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and burgundy that matched the monks' robes, and winter returned with its pristine silence and bone-deep cold. Through all these cycles, the mystery of Tenzin Norbu's disappearance remained unsolved, gradually transforming from urgent concern to accepted tragedy to whispered legend. New monks arrived, learned the rhythms of monastery life, and eventually heard the story of the young man who had vanished without a trace on a September morning in 1995. Some claimed they could sense his presence in the meditation caves. Others insisted they had glimpsed a figure in burgundy robes walking the mountain paths at dawn. But these were the kind of stories that monasteries collect like prayer flags collect wind. Beautiful, meaningful, but impossible to verify. Winter arrived early that year, as if the mountains themselves were mourning. By November of 1995, snow had already begun to accumulate in the higher reaches, and the morning air carried the sharp clarity that comes only at extreme altitude, where every breath requires intention, and every movement becomes a meditation on the effort required to simply exist. Inside Tashil Hunpo Monastery, life continued with the measured rhythm that had sustained the community for generations. But the absence of Tenzin Norbu had created ripples that touched everything. His empty place in the prayer hall remained unfilled, not by decree but by an unspoken understanding among the monks that some spaces cannot be simply replaced. The morning chants seemed to echo differently, as if the architecture itself had adjusted to accommodate the missing voice. Lobsang Tenzin found himself changing his daily routines in small ways that he didn't fully understand. He would take longer paths between buildings, routes that happened to pass by the places where he and Tenzin had often walked together, discussing the finer points of Buddhist philosophy. The old monk's tea tasted different now, not because anything had changed about the leaves or the preparation, but because the conversations that had once accompanied the evening tea ceremony were now conducted with memory instead of presence. The other monks watched their elder with gentle concern. At 73, Lobsang had seen many students come and go, had witnessed deaths and departures, had learned the Buddhist teaching about impermanence, not just as philosophy, but as lived experience. Yet something about Tenzin's disappearance had affected him more deeply than anyone had expected. Perhaps it was because the young monk had reminded him of himself at that age, curious, dedicated, always asking questions that pushed beyond the comfortable boundaries of established teaching. As winter deepened, letters began arriving from Tenzin's family in the village. His mother, Dolma, wrote in careful Tibetan script, asking if there had been any news, any signs, any dreams or visions that might provide guidance. Her letters carried the weight of a parent's unresolved grief, the particular agony of not knowing whether to hope or to mourn. In Tibetan Buddhist culture, the uncertainty was perhaps even more difficult to bear because the spiritual implications of disappearance without death were complex and troubling. Pemba, Tenzin's father, made the difficult journey to the monastery 3 times that winter, his weathered face growing more lined with each visit. He would sit with Lobsang Tenzin for hours, the 2 men sharing tea and silence while snow accumulated outside the windows. Sometimes they would speak of Tenzin's childhood, remembering the boy who had shown unusual interest in the old stories, who had spent hours watching the monastery from their village home, who had seemed to understand something about the spiritual life even before he could properly articulate it. The village itself had been transformed by the mystery. In a community where everyone knew everyone, where news traveled through networks of family and friendship as efficiently as modern communication systems, the unexplained disappearance of someone so young and promising cast a shadow that seemed to touch everything. Farmers working their fields would pause to scan the distant mountains, as if Tenzin might suddenly appear walking down one of the familiar paths. Children playing games began to incorporate elements of the mystery into their stories, creating elaborate scenarios where the missing monk had become everything from a legendary hermit to a supernatural protector of the valley. The local police officer, a man named Dorje who had been assigned to the region only 2 years earlier, found himself returning to the case file repeatedly. He was not originally from Tibet. His Mandarin was better than his Tibetan, and he sometimes struggled with the cultural nuances that seemed to inform every aspect of local life. But he was thorough and genuinely concerned, and he had become personally invested in solving the mystery of the young monk's disappearance. Dorje had interviewed everyone who had been in contact with Tenzin in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. The conversations had been conducted in a mixture of Tibetan, Mandarin, and gestures, sometimes requiring translation from village elders who served as cultural bridges between the official investigation and the community's own understanding of events. What emerged was a picture of a young man who had been behaving normally, perhaps even more contentedly than usual, right up until the moment he vanished. There had been no signs of depression or spiritual crisis, no conflicts with other monks, no financial problems or romantic entanglements that might have motivated a dramatic departure. Tenzin had been progressing well in his studies, had recently been praised by his teachers for a particularly insightful interpretation of a classical text, and had been looking forward to participating in an important ceremony scheduled for later that month. His disappearance made no logical sense, which made it all the more disturbing. As spring approached, bringing the gradual melting of snow and the tentative return of green to the lower elevations, search efforts resumed with the kind of systematic thoroughness that becomes possible when the weather cooperates. Teams of volunteers, coordinated by both monastery officials and local authorities, combed through areas that had been inaccessible during the winter months. They searched caves and ravines, followed stream beds that might have carried evidence downstream, and examined every structure and shelter within a radius of 50 kilometers from the monastery. The search parties discovered many things: old meditation retreats carved into cliffsides, ancient stupas nearly hidden by centuries of vegetation growth, wildlife paths that led to spectacular vantage points overlooking the valley. But they found no trace of Tenzin Norbu. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the physical world, leaving behind only the mystery of his absence and the questions that seemed to multiply rather than diminish with each passing day. During this period, Lobsang Tenzin began having dreams that felt different from ordinary dreams. In them, he would see Tenzin sitting in meditation posture, but the location was unclear. Sometimes it seemed to be a cave, sometimes a structure he didn't recognize, sometimes just a space of light and shadow that defied specific identification. When he woke from these dreams, the old monk felt simultaneously comforted and troubled. Buddhist teaching acknowledged the possibility of communication through dreams, but it also warned against mistaking wishful thinking for genuine spiritual insight. The dreams became more frequent as the first anniversary of the disappearance approached. Other monks began reporting similar experiences: glimpses of burgundy robes in peripheral vision, the sense of a familiar presence during meditation sessions, moments when the prayer hall seemed to contain the same number of voices it had always contained, despite the physically empty space where Tenzin had once knelt. These experiences created their own mystery within the larger mystery. Were they manifestations of collective grief and longing, psychological responses to an unresolved trauma? Or were they something else entirely, evidence that Tenzin's spiritual journey had taken a path that transcended ordinary understanding of presence and absence, of here and there, of continuation and conclusion? The anniversary passed with a special ceremony organized by the monastery. Monks gathered to recite prayers for Tenzin's well-being, wherever he might be, and to ask for guidance in understanding the meaning of his disappearance. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, villagers, family members, fellow monks from other monasteries, and even some officials who had become personally invested in the case. The gathering felt simultaneously like a memorial service and a declaration of continuing hope, an acknowledgement that some mysteries cannot be solved, but must instead be carried with faith and patience. As the second winter after the disappearance settled over the region, bringing its familiar combination of beauty and hardship, the case of the missing monk gradually shifted from active investigation to accepted mystery. Files were not closed. In situations like this, they never truly are. But the urgent energy of the search had transformed into something more sustainable, a quiet, persistent attention to any detail that might someday provide answers. Time moves differently in the mountains. Days are measured not by clocks, but by the angle of shadows cast by peaks that have stood unchanged for millions of years. Seasons arrive and depart with the dramatic certainty of ancient rhythms, and years accumulate like layers of sediment, each one adding weight and depth to the landscape of memory. By 1998, 3 years had passed since Tenzin Norbu's disappearance, and the monastery had found ways to accommodate the absence without forgetting it. New young monks had arrived, bringing their own questions and enthusiasms, their own struggles with homesickness and spiritual discipline. The prayer hall had filled again, though the acoustics seemed subtly different, as if the architecture retained some memory of the missing voice. Lobsang Tenzin, now 76, had grown more reflective in ways that went beyond the normal deepening of age. His morning meditations had become longer, and other monks occasionally found him standing in the places where he and Tenzin used to walk together, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his gaze directed toward the mountains with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something beyond the visible landscape. The old monk had begun working on a project that occupied his evenings and early mornings, a comprehensive record of everything he could remember about Tenzin Norbu. Not just the facts of his disappearance, but the details of his personality, his spiritual insights, his questions and observations, his way of moving through the world. Writing in the careful script he had perfected over decades of copying sacred texts, Lobsang was creating a portrait in words, as if the act of remembering completely might somehow bridge the gap between presence and absence. He had a way of listening, Lobsang wrote one evening by butter lamplight, that made you feel as though your words were being heard not just by him, but by something larger, as if conversation with him was also conversation with the mountains themselves. These observations, accumulated slowly over months and years, began to form a picture of a young man whose spiritual sensitivity might have been unusual even by the standards of monastic life. The wider world beyond the monastery had been changing in ways that seemed to accelerate with each passing year. Technology was arriving in Tibet in fits and starts, bringing new possibilities for communication and connection, but also new complications. The first computers arrived at the regional government offices in 1999, mysterious boxes that promised to revolutionize everything from record-keeping to communication with authorities in distant cities. Dorje, the police officer who had investigated Tenzin's disappearance, had been transferred to a different region in 1998, but not before training his replacement on the details of the unsolved case. The new officer, a younger man named Tashi, who had grown up in a neighboring province, brought different perspectives and different resources to the investigation. He was more comfortable with emerging technologies and more connected to regional law enforcement networks that were slowly being established across the vast reaches of Western China. Under Tashi's guidance, the case file was digitized, a process that involved not just scanning documents, but translating handwritten Tibetan notes into standardized formats that could be accessed by investigators across the region. This modernization had an unexpected effect. It connected Tenzin's disappearance to other missing person cases from across the Tibetan plateau, revealing patterns that had not been visible when each case existed in isolation. Several young people had disappeared from remote areas over the past decade, not in numbers that suggested anything systematic or criminal, but enough to create a small network of unsolved mysteries. Some had been students, others farmers or herders, a few monks or nuns from various religious communities. What they had in common was their age, all between 17 and 25, their spiritual inclinations, and the complete absence of evidence about what had happened to them. These connections led to new theories about Tenzin's disappearance, though none proved more satisfactory than the original mystery. Perhaps there was a hidden community somewhere in the mountains, a place where young people went to pursue extreme forms of spiritual practice. Perhaps there were caves or valleys, so remote that people could disappear into them completely, living in ways that left no trace visible to the outside world. Perhaps the harsh conditions and vast distances of the Tibetan plateau simply made it possible for individuals to vanish in ways that would be impossible in more populated or thoroughly surveyed regions. By 2003, 8 years after the disappearance, these speculations had become part of local folklore. Stories were told around fires and over tea about the young people who had gone to the hidden valley, who had joined the invisible monastery, who had found the path that leads beyond the world. The stories were told not with fear, but with a mixture of wonder and acceptance, as if the disappearances were mysterious but not necessarily tragic, as if they represented a kind of spiritual possibility that existed alongside more conventional forms of religious practice. Tenzin's parents, Dolma and Pemba, had aged in the way that grief accelerates time. Their faces showed not just the accumulation of years, but the particular wearing that comes from carrying unanswered questions. They had never stopped hoping for news, but their hope had evolved into something more complex, a desire not just for their son's return, but for understanding, for some explanation that would allow them to make peace with his absence. Dolma had become something of a local authority on missing persons, helping other families navigate the bureaucratic and emotional challenges of unexplained disappearances. Her home had become a gathering place for parents and siblings dealing with similar mysteries, a space where people could share their fears and hopes without having to explain the particular kind of grief that comes from not knowing whether to mourn or to keep waiting. The monastery itself had changed in subtle ways that reflected the passage of time and the persistence of mystery. A small shrine had been established in one of the meditation caves, not officially dedicated to Tenzin, but understood by everyone to be connected to his memory and to hopes for his well-being. Monks would sometimes leave offerings there, butter lamps, flowers, small scrolls with prayers written in careful script. The shrine had become a place for contemplating all the uncertainties of spiritual life, all the questions that Buddhist practice acknowledges without necessarily answering. New monks arriving at the monastery would eventually hear the story of Tenzin Norbu, usually told by older students during the quiet hours between formal instruction and sleep. The story had acquired layers and variations over the years, but its essential mystery remained intact. Some versions emphasized his scholarly abilities, others his meditation skills, still others his unusual sensitivity to the natural world. All versions ended the same way, with a question mark, with an invitation to wonder about the possibilities that existed beyond ordinary understanding. As the 10th anniversary of the disappearance approached in 2005, Lobsang Tenzin made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. At the age of 83, he announced that he wanted to undertake one final search for his missing student, not the kind of organized effort that had been mounted in the years immediately following the disappearance, but a personal pilgrimage to remote areas where he had never looked before, places that would require weeks of difficult travel and that might well prove to be beyond his physical capabilities. The other monks tried to dissuade him, pointing out the dangers of such a journey for someone his age, the likelihood that he would find nothing but exhaustion and frustration. But Lobsang's determination had the quality of spiritual conviction, and in monastic communities, such convictions are treated with respect even when they seem impractical or potentially harmful. The preparations for his journey took months. Maps were studied, supplies gathered, contacts made with monasteries and villages along possible routes. The old monk planned to visit every remote monastery, every hermitage cave, every place where someone seeking extreme solitude might have found refuge. He would carry with him a photograph of Tenzin and the detailed written record he had been compiling over the years, hoping that somewhere someone would recognize the young man who had vanished on a September morning a decade earlier. The journey began on a morning in late spring of 2005, when the snow had receded enough to make high-altitude travel possible, but the summer heat had not yet made lower elevations uncomfortable. Lobsang Tenzin, despite his 83 years, moved with the steady determination of someone who had spent a lifetime walking mountain paths. His pace measured but relentless, his breathing adjusted to the thin air through decades of practice. He was not traveling alone. Tashi Nobu, a younger monk who had arrived at Tashilhunpo only 3 years earlier, but who had shown exceptional skill in navigation and mountain travel, had volunteered to accompany the elderly teacher. At 35, Tashi was strong enough to carry most of the supplies and experienced enough to make decisions about weather and route safety, but humble enough to understand that this was Lobsang's pilgrimage and that his role was to facilitate rather than to lead. Their first destination was Rongbuk Monastery, the highest monastery in the world, situated at more than 16,000 feet above sea level in the shadow of Mount Everest. The journey required 4 days of walking through landscape that seemed to exist at the edge of the inhabitable world, vast expanses of stone and sky where the horizon shimmered with distances that made human concerns feel both insignificant and intensely precious. At Rongbuk, the abbot, a man named Ngawang who had known Lobsang for more than 40 years, received them with the tea and conversation that formed the essential courtesies of monastic hospitality. When Lobsang explained the purpose of his journey and showed the photograph of Tenzin Norbu, Ngawang studied the image for a long time, his weathered finger tracing the young man's features as if trying to summon memory through touch. "There are always young monks who come seeking solitude," Ngawang said finally, his voice carrying the deliberate cadence of someone accustomed to choosing words carefully. "Some stay for days, others for months. A few disappear into the mountains and are never seen again. It is not unusual, though it is always mysterious." He could not specifically remember Tenzin, but he promised to ask the other monks and to send word if anyone recalled a young man matching the description. The pattern repeated at monastery after monastery, as Lobsang and Tashi made their way through the remote regions of the Tibetan plateau. At each stop, they would be welcomed with varying degrees of formality, offered food and shelter, and given the opportunity to tell their story and show their photograph. Some monasteries kept detailed records of visitors, others relied entirely on memory. Some abbots had heard rumors about young people disappearing in the mountains. Others insisted that such things were impossible in their well-regulated communities. What emerged gradually from these conversations was a picture of a landscape that was both thoroughly mapped and mysteriously unmappable. Every monastery knew the locations of other religious communities within several days' travel. Every abbot could recite the names and histories of dozens of meditation caves and retreat sites. Every monk could navigate by landmarks that had been significant for centuries. Yet there were always stories about places that existed beyond this known geography, caves that could only be found by those who were spiritually prepared to find them, valleys that appeared to some travelers but remained invisible to others, monasteries that existed in states between legend and reality. After 6 weeks of travel that had taken them through some of the most remote and spectacular terrain on earth, Lobsang and Tashi reached a small monastery called Padmasambhava Gompa, built into a cliff face at an elevation that made every physical activity an exercise in conscious breathing. The monastery was so isolated that it received visitors perhaps a dozen times per year, and its 7 resident monks had developed the intense focus and gentle manner that comes from long periods of solitude broken by brief but meaningful contact with the outside world. The abbot of Padmasambhava Gompa was a woman named Ani Pema, unusual in a region where female spiritual leaders were rare but not unknown. She had been leading the small community for more than 20 years, having arrived there as a young nun, seeking the kind of intensive meditation practice that was only possible in conditions of extreme isolation. When Lobsang showed her the photograph of Tenzin Norbu, her reaction was different from any they had encountered during their journey. Annie Pema held the photograph for several minutes, not just looking at it but seeming to listen to it, as if images could carry sounds inaudible to ordinary hearing. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. "I have not seen this young man," she said, "but I have dreamed about him." She paused, letting the implications of this statement settle in the thin air of the meditation hall where they were sitting. "For several years I have been having dreams about a monk in burgundy robes who sits in meditation in a place I do not recognize. The dreams always feel significant, though I have never understood why." The conversation that followed lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, covering territories that moved between the practical and the mystical, with the fluid ease that characterizes discussions among serious Buddhist practitioners. Annie Pema described her dreams in detail, the sense of a presence that was simultaneously familiar and unknown, the image of someone engaged in meditation so intense that it seemed to alter the physical environment around him, the feeling that these dreams were not originating from her own mind, but were being somehow transmitted from elsewhere. Lobsang found himself sharing not just the facts of Tenzin's disappearance, but the deeper questions that had been troubling him for 10 years. What did it mean for someone to vanish so completely? Was it possible for a person to leave the ordinary world without dying, to continue existing in ways that transcended normal understanding of presence and absence? In Buddhist teaching, such possibilities were acknowledged but rarely discussed in practical terms, and Lobsang had been struggling with the gap between philosophical acceptance and lived experience. As they prepared to leave Padmasambhava Gompa the next morning, Annie Pema made an unexpected offer. She had been planning her own pilgrimage to an area even more remote than her monastery, a region known as the Hidden Valley of Meditation, where ancient masters had supposedly established retreat sites so secluded that they could only be reached by those whose spiritual development had prepared them for the journey. She invited Lobsang and Tashi to accompany her, warning them that the travel would be more difficult than anything they had yet undertaken, and that they might find nothing but empty caves and challenging weather. The decision to continue took place without words. Lobsang simply began adjusting his pack and checking his supplies, while Tashi studied the maps and calculated how much additional food they would need. Sometimes the most important decisions feel inevitable rather than chosen, and this was one of those moments when the path forward revealed itself as clearly as a prayer flag snapping in mountain wind. The journey to the Hidden Valley required 8 days of travel through terrain that seemed to exist at the intersection of geography and mythology. They followed paths that were sometimes carved into cliff faces, sometimes traced across scree fields, where every step required attention and balance, sometimes marked only by cairns left by previous travelers whose purposes and destinations remained unknown. The landscape grew progressively more dramatic and more austere, as if they were approaching some essential core of wildness that existed beyond human modification or interpretation. On the 6th day, they reached a pass that offered views in all directions of peaks and valleys that showed no signs of human presence. No roads, no buildings, no evidence of agriculture or settlement. The world spread below them seemed to belong to an earlier era of Earth history, when mountains and sky and weather were the only forces that mattered. Standing at that vantage point, breathing air so thin that each inhalation required conscious effort, Lobsang felt simultaneously diminished and expanded, reminded of both human insignificance and human capability for transcendence. It was from this pass that Annie Pema pointed toward a valley that was barely visible in the distance, a narrow cut between peaks that seemed to lead deeper into the mountain range rather than toward any kind of destination that could be reached by ordinary travel. "That is where we are going," she said, her voice carrying across the empty air with startling clarity. "That is where the caves are." The descent from the high pass toward the hidden valley of meditation took 2 days, following a path that seemed to have been designed by someone who understood that the journey to sacred places should require not just physical effort, but psychological transformation. The trail wound through landscapes that shifted between austere beauty and intimidating grandeur, past formations of rock and ice that seemed to have been shaped by forces operating on timescales beyond human comprehension. As they descended, the air gradually became more breathable, though they were still at an elevation that made every physical activity a conscious exercise. The valley itself was narrow and steep-sided, with walls of granite and limestone that rose so dramatically that they seemed to meet overhead, creating a sense of moving through a vast natural cathedral. A stream ran along the valley floor, fed by snowmelt and springs, its sound echoing off the stone walls with a clarity that made ordinary speech seem intrusive. Ani Pema had been to the valley once before, nearly 15 years earlier, but she moved through it with the confidence of someone following an internal map rather than relying on visual landmarks. The caves they were seeking were not visible from the main valley floor. They had to be approached through side canyons and across rock faces that required careful climbing and complete attention to balance and hand placement. The first cave they examined had clearly been used as a meditation retreat, though not recently. Stone platforms had been carved to create level spaces for sitting, walls had been smoothed to reduce wind noise, and there were remains of simple shelters built to provide protection from weather, without completely closing off the connection to the natural environment. But the cave felt empty in ways that went beyond physical absence. There was no sense of recent habitation, no items left behind, no indication that anyone had been there within the past several years. The second cave was larger and showed signs of more extensive modification. Steps had been cut into the rock to create access to different levels, and there were niches carved into the walls that would have held butter lamps or small statues. More significantly, there were traces of relatively recent occupancy, ashes from fires that could not have been more than a few years old, scratches in the stone that looked like they had been made by modern tools, and most intriguingly, several small pieces of burgundy cloth that might have come from monastic robes. Lobsang examined these fragments with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades handling religious textiles. The weave and color were consistent with the kind of robes worn at Tashil Hunpo Monastery, though such robes were also used at dozens of other monasteries across Tibet. More significant was the way the cloth had been torn, not by wear or accident, but deliberately, as if someone had wanted to leave small signs of their presence without creating obvious markers that would attract attention. As they explored deeper into the cave system, following passages that led into the mountain rather than simply providing shelter from weather, they discovered evidence of what could only be described as a long-term retreat. In a chamber roughly 30 feet square, accessed through a passage so narrow that it had to be navigated sideways, they found a complete meditation setup that showed signs of regular use over a period of years. The chamber contained a raised stone platform covered with what had once been a meditation cushion, now worn down to threads and filling. Along one wall, niches had been carved to hold supplies, empty now, but showing traces of sampa barley flour, dried tea leaves, and other simple foods that would sustain someone engaged in intensive spiritual practice. Most remarkably, the walls showed evidence of careful decoration. Simple geometric patterns carved into the stone, along with what appeared to be Tibetan script, though much of it was too weathered or deliberately obscured to read clearly. Tashi, whose eyesight was sharper than his companions, spent considerable time examining the carved text. Most of it consisted of traditional prayers and mantras, the kind of sacred phrases that meditation practitioners often carve or write as part of their spiritual discipline. But in one corner, Barely visible unless the light struck it at exactly the right angle, he found something that made him call the others over urgently. Carved in small, precise characters was a name, Tenzin Norbu. Below it, a date, 1996. And below that, a phrase in Tibetan that translated roughly as seeking the path beyond paths. The discovery hit Lobsang with a force that made him sit down abruptly on the stone floor of the cave. For 10 years, he had been carrying questions about what had happened to his student, imagining scenarios that ranged from tragic to miraculous, never quite able to settle on any explanation that felt complete. Now, holding a butter lamp close to the carved inscription, he was confronting the possibility that Tenzin had not died, had not been injured or lost, but had chosen to disappear into a form of spiritual practice so intense and so complete that it required total separation from the ordinary world. The implications were overwhelming. If Tenzin had carved this inscription in 1996, he had been alive at least a year after his disappearance, long enough to make his way to this extraordinarily remote location and establish what appeared to be a long-term retreat. But the chamber showed no signs of recent habitation. The meditation cushion was deteriorated, the food niches were empty, and there was a quality of abandonment that suggested no one had been there for several years. Ani Pema, who had remained silent during the initial excitement of discovery, finally spoke with the measured tone of someone who had spent years contemplating the mysteries of advanced spiritual practice. "There are teachings," she said, "about practitioners who reach such depths of meditation that they transcend ordinary physical needs. They may appear to disappear from the world, not because they have died, but because they have moved into states of consciousness that exist beyond normal understanding of presence and absence." The conversation that followed took place over several hours, as afternoon light filtering through the cave entrance gradually shifted from gold to silver to the deep blue of mountain twilight. They discussed the possibilities suggested by their discovery, that Tenzin had spent some years in this retreat, pursuing meditation practices of extraordinary intensity, that he might have achieved states of realization that allowed him to exist in ways that transcended ordinary physical limitations, that his disappearance might represent not tragedy, but transformation. But questions remained that were impossible to answer with certainty. If Tenzin had been in this cave, where was he now? Had he achieved some form of enlightenment that allowed him to exist without leaving physical traces? Had he moved to an even more remote location to continue his practice? Had he died here and been naturally reclaimed by the mountain environment in ways that left no obvious remains? As night fell and they prepared to spend the evening in the cave, Lobsang found himself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions that he struggled to understand. There was relief at finally having some evidence of what had happened to Tenzin, gratitude for the confirmation that his student had been alive and pursuing spiritual goals. But there was also a new kind of grief, the realization that Tenzin's path had taken him so far beyond ordinary life that reunion in any conventional sense was probably impossible. That night, each of the 3 travelers experienced dreams that felt different from ordinary sleeping visions. Lobsang dreamed of sitting in meditation with Tenzin in a space that was simultaneously the cave where they were sleeping and somewhere else entirely, a place of light and silence where communication took place without words and where the usual boundaries between self and other seemed permeable. When he woke, he retained a sense of having actually been in conversation with his student, though he could not recall specific content of their exchange. Ani Pema dreamed of the same meditation hall where she had been seeing the unknown monk for years, but now she recognized the figure as Tenzin from the photograph. In her dream, he was engaged in a form of meditation so profound that it seemed to be transforming not just his own consciousness, but the physical environment around him, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond the immediate space of his practice. Tashi, who rarely remembered his dreams, woke with an unusually clear vision of the cave system they had been exploring, but seen from an impossible perspective, as if he were viewing it simultaneously from inside and outside, from above and below, understanding its structure in ways that transcended normal spatial relationships. In this vision, the caves were not just empty spaces in rock, but were somehow alive, responsive to the spiritual energy of those who used them for meditation. Morning brought clarity of a different kind. As dawn light began to illuminate the intricate geological formations of the hidden valley, the three practitioners sat together in the meditation chamber, each engaged in their own contemplative practice, but united by their shared proximity to mystery. The silence was profound, not just the absence of human-made sound, but a quality of stillness that seemed to emerge from the mountains themselves. During this meditation session, Lobsang experienced something that he would later struggle to describe in words. It was not exactly a vision, not quite a memory, but a sense of presence that felt unmistakably like Tenzin. Not the young monk as he had been 10 years earlier, but something that retained essential characteristics while transcending the limitations of ordinary identity. The experience lasted only moments, but it carried a quality of communication that felt complete and final, an acknowledgement of connection across whatever distance separated them, and a blessing for the continuation of their respective spiritual journeys. When they emerged from meditation, none of them spoke immediately about what they had experienced. Instead, they carefully photographed the carved inscription, made detailed notes about the location and characteristics of the cave, and gathered the few remaining physical artifacts that might provide additional clues about Tenzin's time there. They also left offerings, butter lamps, prayer flags, and written prayers, acknowledging the sacred nature of the space and honoring whatever transformation had taken place there. The journey back to inhabited regions took 4 days, retracing their route through landscapes that now seemed familiar, but somehow changed by what they had discovered. The physical evidence they carried, photographs, notes, the fragments of burgundy cloth, felt almost secondary to the internal transformation that had resulted from encountering the mystery of Tenzin's disappearance in its actual location rather than simply as an absence to be explained. The return to Tashil Hunpo Monastery marked the beginning of a period that would later be remembered as a time of quiet revelation. Lobsang Tenzin, now 83 and visibly changed by his journey to the hidden valley, faced the delicate task of sharing what he had discovered, while honoring the profound mystery that remained at the heart of Tenzin Norbu's disappearance. The monastery received the news with the careful attention that monastic communities bring to reports of unusual spiritual phenomena. The carved inscription, the evidence of long-term retreat, the possibilities suggested by years of intensive meditation practice, all of these were discussed in the formal contexts where such matters were traditionally considered. But the conversations that mattered most took place in smaller groups, during the quiet hours between formal activities, when monks could speak openly about the implications of what had been discovered. For many in the community, the findings provided a sense of resolution that had been missing for 10 years. The mystery of Tenzin's disappearance had been transformed from a source of worry and confusion into something that could be understood within the framework of advanced spiritual practice. While questions remained about his ultimate fate, there was now evidence that his disappearance had been purposeful rather than tragic, spiritual rather than accidental. But for Lobsang, the discovery had created new forms of contemplation that went beyond relief or closure. His student had achieved something that existed at the edges of ordinary understanding, a level of spiritual realization that allowed transcendence of conventional limitations. The old monk found himself grappling with teachings he had studied for decades, but never encountered in such immediate personal terms. The news of the discovery spread beyond the monastery through networks of communication that operated at the pace of mountain life, slowly, deliberately, carrying emotional weight along with factual information. Tenzin's parents, Dolma and Pemba, received word through a village elder who had connections to the monastery, and their reaction reflected the complex nature of what had been revealed. There was gratitude for finally having some answers, relief at learning that their son had been alive years after his disappearance, and pride in understanding that his spiritual development had reached extraordinary levels. But there was also a new kind of grief, the realization that Tenzin had moved so far beyond ordinary existence that reunion in any conventional sense was impossible. They were being asked to mourn not death, but transformation, to accept loss that was simultaneously spiritual achievement. Over the months that followed, the story of Tenzin Norbu's retreat in the Hidden Valley became part of local oral tradition, told and retold, with variations that reflected different aspects of its significance. Some versions emphasized the dedication required to reach such remote locations and sustain intensive practice for years without external support. Others focused on the spiritual implications of meditation so profound that it seemed to alter the relationship between practitioner and physical environment. The discovery also had practical implications for the ongoing investigation into missing persons across the Tibetan plateau. Officer Tashi, who had inherited the case files from his predecessor, found himself reconsidering other unexplained disappearances in light of what had been learned about Tenzin's fate. Perhaps some of the other missing young people had also chosen extreme forms of spiritual retreat, pursuing paths that led beyond ordinary social existence. This possibility led to new search efforts, though these were conducted with different intentions than the original investigations. Rather than assuming that missing persons were victims of accidents or crimes, search teams began looking for evidence of chosen retreat, meditation caves that showed signs of long-term habitation, remote areas where dedicated practitioners might establish sustainable solitude, locations that offered the combination of accessibility and isolation required for intensive spiritual practice. Some of these searches yielded results that paralleled the discovery in the Hidden Valley. Caves were found that contained evidence of extended meditation retreats, including carved inscriptions, meditation platforms, and remains of simple shelters. A few included names or dates that could be connected to specific missing persons, though never with the clarity of Tenzin's case. These discoveries began to suggest a pattern that had previously been invisible. A network of young spiritual seekers who had chosen forms of practice so intensive that they required complete separation from conventional social life. The pattern was not systematic or organized in any formal sense, but it represented a phenomenon that occurred regularly enough to constitute a recognizable aspect of contemporary Tibetan religious culture. By 2007, 12 years after Tenzin's original disappearance, his story had evolved from local mystery to regional legend. Monasteries across the plateau knew some version of his story, and young monks contemplating intensive retreat would sometimes reference his example when discussing the possibilities and challenges of extreme spiritual practice. His name had become associated with the kind of dedication that transcends ordinary limitations, though always with acknowledgement of the costs such dedication requires. The technological changes that continued to transform communication across Tibet meant that stories like Tenzin's could now travel faster and farther than ever before. Digital cameras made it possible to share images of carved inscriptions and meditation caves, while satellite phones allowed remote monasteries to communicate discoveries immediately rather than waiting for the next visiting pilgrim or supply caravan. But these technological capabilities also raised new questions about privacy and spiritual protection. If locations like the Hidden Valley became too well known, they might lose the isolation that made them suitable for intensive retreat. There were discussions among monastery leaders about how to balance the desire to understand and document these phenomena with the need to preserve the conditions that made them possible. Lobsang Tenzin, whose health had been gradually declining since his journey to the Hidden Valley, spent his final years working on a comprehensive record of what he had learned about spiritual retreat and advanced meditation practice. His writings, composed in the careful script that had characterized all his scholarly work, attempted to place Tenzin's story within the broader context of Tibetan Buddhist teaching about the highest levels of spiritual realization. The old monk died peacefully in the winter of 2009, 14 years after his student's disappearance, during a meditation session in the same hall where Tenzin had once knelt for morning prayers. His final writings, discovered after his death, included detailed instructions for reaching the Hidden Valley and careful documentation of everything he had observed there. But they also included warnings about the spiritual preparation required for such journeys and cautions against seeking such places without proper understanding of their significance. Among Lobsang's papers was found a letter addressed to Tenzin Norbu, though it was clearly not intended for conventional delivery. The letter expressed gratitude for the teaching that came through mystery, appreciation for spiritual courage that transcended ordinary understanding, and hope for continuation of connection across whatever distances or transformations separated teacher and student. It ended with a simple prayer that wherever Tenzin's practice had taken him, he had found the peace and realization he had been seeking. The year 2015 marked 20 years since Tenzin Norbu's disappearance, and the world had changed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine on that September morning, when a young monk simply failed to appear for morning prayers. Satellites now provided images of the Earth's surface with resolution clear enough to distinguish individual buildings, and computer networks allowed information to be shared instantaneously across distances that had once required weeks of travel to cross. It was in this context of technological transformation that Dr. Sarah Chen, a research specialist in high-resolution satellite imagery working for an international mapping project, made a discovery that would reopen questions about Tenzin's fate in ways no one had anticipated. Dr. Chen was part of a team documenting remote religious sites across the Himalayas, using satellite technology to create detailed maps of monasteries, stupas, and meditation caves that had never been formally surveyed. The project had scientific and cultural preservation goals, understanding how religious communities had adapted to extreme environments, documenting architectural techniques that had sustained buildings for centuries in harsh conditions, and creating records that could aid in conservation efforts. But it also had the unintended effect of revealing details about landscapes that had previously been known only to those who traveled through them on foot. Dr. Chen was examining high-resolution images of the region around the Hidden Valley of Meditation when she noticed something that made her pause and adjust her computer screen for better contrast. In a valley that appeared empty and uninhabited in conventional maps, the satellite imagery showed what appeared to be a structured complex that was clearly artificial, but unlike any monastery or settlement she had seen in the region. The complex consisted of several buildings arranged around what appeared to be a central courtyard, with architectural features that suggested Tibetan religious design, but with proportions and layout that didn't match any known monastery. More intriguingly, the buildings appeared to be partially integrated into the natural rock formations, as if they had been designed to minimize their visual impact when viewed from ground level or from conventional aircraft. The discovery prompted Dr. Chen to examine satellite images of the same area from different years, looking for changes over time that might provide clues about when the complex had been built and whether it was currently in use. What she found was remarkable. The earliest clear images from 1999 showed no evidence of the structures. By 2003, foundations were visible. By 2007, the complex appeared complete. The most recent images from 2014 showed what appeared to be cultivation areas around the buildings and other signs of active habitation. Dr. Chen brought her findings to Dr. James Morrison, the project director, who had extensive experience with both satellite imagery analysis and Tibetan cultural studies. Morrison's reaction was immediate recognition that they had discovered something unprecedented. A monastery or retreat center that had been built in complete secrecy over a period of several years in one of the most remote locations on Earth. The implications were staggering. Constructing buildings in such a location would have required transporting materials across terrain that challenged even experienced mountain travelers, and doing so without detection suggested extraordinary planning and dedication. More significantly, the apparent secrecy of the construction raised questions about who had built the complex and why they had chosen to remain hidden from outside observation. Morrison contacted colleagues at universities with strong Tibetan studies programs, sharing the satellite images and asking for input about possible explanations. The responses revealed that while such hidden monasteries existed in legend and ancient history, nothing comparable had been documented in modern times. The closest parallels were meditation retreats established by individual practitioners, but those typically consisted of simple caves or small shelters, not formal architectural complexes. One of Morrison's contacts was Dr. Tenzin Wangyal, a Tibetan Buddhist scholar who had been born in Tibet but was now teaching at a university in California. When Dr. Wangyal saw the satellite images, his reaction was different from the academic curiosity shown by other scholars. He studied the images for a long time, then asked specific questions about the location and the timeline of construction. "There have been stories," Dr. Wangyal said finally, "about young practitioners who disappeared from established monasteries and were believed to have joined hidden communities dedicated to intensive meditation practice. These stories were usually dismissed as folklore, but your discovery suggests that some of them might have been accurate." Dr. Wangyal's comments led Morrison to research documented cases of missing persons from Tibetan monasteries, which eventually brought him into contact with the case files related to Tenzin Norbu and the other disappearances that had been connected to his story. The geographical proximity between the hidden monastery, revealed by satellite imagery, and the hidden valley, where evidence of Tenzin's retreat had been found, was too significant to be coincidental. Morrison reached out to current administrators at Tashil Hunpo Monastery, sharing the satellite images and asking whether they might be related to any known activities or missing persons from their community. The response came from Abbot Lobsang Jinpa, who had been a young monk when Tenzin disappeared, but who had since assumed leadership responsibilities and had access to all the records related to the case. The abbot's reaction to the satellite images was immediate and profound. He recognized the architectural style as consistent with traditional Tibetan monastery design, but noted modifications that suggested construction by people with extensive knowledge of both religious architecture and modern techniques for minimizing environmental impact. More significantly, he confirmed that the location was within the region where Tenzin Norbu and possibly other missing practitioners had been pursuing intensive retreat. These connections prompted the first formal expedition to investigate the hidden monastery, organized jointly by the International Mapping Project and Tashil Hunpo Monastery, with participation from local authorities who retained jurisdiction over the region. The expedition was planned with extraordinary care, recognizing that they might be approaching a community that had chosen secrecy for important spiritual reasons, and that intrusion could be both culturally insensitive and potentially dangerous. The journey to the hidden monastery required 8 days of travel through terrain that was even more challenging than the route to the hidden valley where Tenzin's meditation cave had been discovered. The satellite images had provided general location information, but finding the actual approach routes required navigation skills that drew on both modern GPS technology and traditional knowledge of mountain travel. When the expedition finally reached the valley where the satellite images had located the mysterious complex, they discovered something that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The monastery was not only real and inhabited, but it represented a level of architectural and engineering sophistication that challenged assumptions about what was possible in such remote locations. The buildings were indeed partially integrated into natural rock formations, but in ways that enhanced rather than concealed their visual impact when viewed from within the valley. Solar panels and wind generators provided electricity. Sophisticated water management systems captured and distributed moisture from various sources, and carefully designed growing areas produced food sufficient to sustain a community of considerable size. Most remarkably, the community was clearly aware of the approaching expedition long before it reached the monastery grounds. Figures in burgundy robes could be seen observing from various vantage points, and when the expedition finally reached the main courtyard, they were met by a reception committee that seemed to have been expecting them. The leader of the reception committee was a monk whose presence immediately commanded attention, not through any dramatic gesture or formal authority, but through the kind of stillness that suggests deep meditation practice and the serene confidence that comes from years of spiritual development. He appeared to be in his 40s, with the weather-lined face of someone who had spent considerable time at high altitude, and eyes that held the particular clarity that experienced practitioners sometimes develop. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to choosing words carefully, and his first words acknowledged both the expedition's journey and the significance of their arrival. "We have been expecting you," he said in accented but fluent English, "though perhaps not exactly when you would come." Dr. Morrison, who had been designated as the expedition's spokesperson, found himself momentarily uncertain about how to proceed. The protocols for approaching isolated religious communities had been discussed extensively during their preparation, but the reality of confronting a monastery that had been built in secret and that clearly operated according to principles different from conventional religious institutions created challenges they had not fully anticipated. The monk, who introduced himself as Lama Tubten, seemed to understand their uncertainty and gestured toward a building that appeared to serve as a guest reception area. "Please," he said, "you have traveled far and difficult paths to reach us. Allow us to offer tea and rest, and then we can speak about the questions that brought you here." The guest area was simple but comfortable, with architectural details that demonstrated both aesthetic sophistication and practical adaptation to extreme environmental conditions. Large windows provided views of the surrounding peaks, while sophisticated insulation systems maintained comfortable temperatures despite the altitude and harsh climate. Most remarkably, the space was clearly designed to accommodate visitors, suggesting that secrecy did not mean isolation from all outside contact. As tea was served according to traditional Tibetan customs, Lama Thubten began to explain the history and purpose of the hidden monastery in ways that gradually addressed the questions the expedition had brought with them. The community, he said, had been established by practitioners who sought forms of intensive meditation practice that required complete separation from the ordinary world, but who also recognized the value of community support for such demanding spiritual work. Many young monks and nuns, he explained, reach points in their practice where conventional monastery life becomes insufficient for their spiritual development. They need conditions that allow continuous meditation, freedom from social obligations, and the kind of silence that can only be found in places like this. But individual retreat, while valuable, can also be limiting. Here, we provide community without distraction, support without social complexity. The conversation continued for several hours, covering the practical challenges of building and sustaining a monastery in such a remote location, the spiritual principles that guided their community life, and the careful balance they maintained between secrecy and openness. The secrecy, Lama Thubten explained, was not intended to hide wrongdoing or to avoid legitimate authority, but to protect the conditions necessary for intensive spiritual practice from the disruptions that would inevitably follow widespread knowledge of their existence. When Dr. Morrison finally asked directly about missing persons who might have joined their community, Lama Thubten's response confirmed what they had hoped to learn while revealing complexities they had not anticipated. "We do not accept everyone who seeks to join us," he said. "The practice we engage in here requires preparation and commitment that goes beyond ordinary religious dedication. But over the years, some practitioners who disappeared from conventional monasteries have found their way here and have become part of our community." The question about Tenzin Norbu was asked with particular delicacy, accompanied by photographs and copies of the records that had been compiled about his disappearance and the evidence found in the Hidden Valley meditation cave. Lama Thubten examined these materials with careful attention, then remained silent for several minutes before responding. "Tenzin Norbu," he said finally, "was one of the first practitioners to join our community, though that was not his intention when he began his retreat in the Hidden Valley. He spent 3 years in intensive solitary practice before he became aware of our existence and requested permission to join us. By that time, his spiritual development had reached levels that qualified him for the kind of practice we support here." The revelation that Tenzin was not only alive but had been living and practicing at the hidden monastery for more than 15 years created reactions among the expedition members that ranged from relief to amazement to new forms of concern about the implications of their discovery. If Tenzin was indeed at the monastery, questions arose about whether he could be contacted, whether he would want to communicate with his original community, and whether such contact would be consistent with the spiritual commitments he had undertaken. Lama Thubten seemed to understand these concerns and offered a possibility that addressed them while respecting the complexities involved. "Tenzin Norbu is here," he said, "but he is also engaged in a meditation retreat that has been continuous for several years and that should not be interrupted without serious spiritual justification. However, if those who knew him would like to send messages or expressions of concern, these can be shared with him in ways that honor his practice while allowing him to decide how to respond." The opportunity to communicate with Tenzin, even indirectly, prompted immediate discussion among expedition members about how to proceed. Dr. Morrison was primarily concerned with documenting their discovery and understanding its implications for the broader research project. Abbot Lobsang Jinpa from Tashil Hunpo Monastery was focused on the well-being of a former member of his community and the spiritual significance of what Tenzin had achieved. The representatives from local authorities were grappling with jurisdictional questions about a community that operated outside conventional legal frameworks. After extensive consultation, they agreed to compose a message that would be shared with Tenzin, expressing gratitude for learning about his well-being, respect for his spiritual choices, and openness to whatever form of communication, if any, he felt appropriate. The message also included specific greetings from people who had known him at Tashil Hunpo, including mention of Lobsang Tenzin's journey to find him and the old teacher's final writings about their relationship. Lama Thubten accepted the message and promised that it would be shared with Tenzin in a manner consistent with his meditation practice and spiritual commitments. He also invited the expedition members to remain at the monastery for several days, offering them the opportunity to observe community life and understand more fully the nature of the practice and living situation that Tenzin had chosen. The days that followed provided insights into a form of religious community life that combined traditional Tibetan Buddhist practice with innovations designed to support the most intensive forms of meditation training. The daily schedule revolved around extended meditation sessions, with minimal time devoted to conventional social interaction or administrative activities. Community members maintained silence except during designated periods, and even then, conversation was focused primarily on spiritual instruction and guidance. Yet there was also evident care for individual well-being and community sustainability. Gardens and workshops provided food and necessary goods, while carefully designed systems for waste management and resource conservation allowed the community to maintain minimal environmental impact despite their presence in a pristine wilderness area. Most remarkably, the community included members with expertise in everything from high-altitude construction to sustainable agriculture to advanced meditation instruction, suggesting a level of planning and intentionality that went far beyond spontaneous religious enthusiasm. On their final evening at the monastery, as the expedition prepared to begin their journey back to the outside world, Lama Thubten approached Dr. Morrison with a package wrapped in traditional Tibetan silk. "This is Tenzin Norbu's response to your message," he said. "He asked that it be shared with those who have been concerned about his welfare, and particularly with anyone who knew his teacher, Lobsang Tenzin." The return journey took 6 days, during which expedition members had ample time to process what they had discovered and consider the implications of their findings. They carried with them detailed photographs of the hidden monastery, recordings of their conversations with Lama Thubten, and most importantly, Tenzin Norbu's written response to news of the ongoing concern about his disappearance. Back at Tashil Hunpo Monastery, Abbot Lobsang Jinpa opened Tenzin's letter in the presence of the monks who had known him 20 years earlier. The letter was written in the careful script they remembered, though the handwriting showed the maturity that comes from years of copying sacred texts and recording spiritual insights. In it, Tenzin expressed gratitude for the concern that had been shown for his welfare, grief at learning of Lobsang Tenzin's death, and deep appreciation for his teacher's journey to the hidden valley and the dedication it represented. More significantly, the letter provided insight into the spiritual journey that had led from his original disappearance to his current situation. Tenzin described the years of solitary retreat, the gradual deepening of meditation practice that had eventually transcended ordinary concerns about social connection and conventional religious community, and the recognition that his path required forms of support and guidance that could only be found in a community like the hidden monastery. "I have not abandoned the teachings or the community that formed me," he wrote. "Rather, I have found ways to practice those teachings more completely than would have been possible within conventional monastic life. The path I have chosen requires sacrifices that I understand may be difficult for others to accept, but it has also provided realizations that justify those sacrifices and that I hope will eventually benefit many beings." The letter concluded with specific messages for individuals who had been part of his early monastic life, including expressions of gratitude, requests for forgiveness for any worry his disappearance had caused, and assurances that his spiritual development continued in ways that honored the foundation, provided by his original teachers and community. If stories like Sarah's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.